What if the difference between life and death came down to a single needle? Let that sink in. For most of human history, there were no heated homes, no thick modern jackets, no stockpiled food behind supermarket shelves, just an unforgiving season that returned every single year. Winter, and for early humans, surviving it wasn't guaranteed. It was a battle fought with fire, fur, fat, and careful planning. Today, we're asking a question that sounds simple, but hides one of the greatest survival stories in human history. How did ancient humans survive the freezing winter? Go back to the last ice age. Temperatures far below anything most modern humans have ever experienced. Wind that could freeze exposed skin within minutes. Snow that could bury an entire camp overnight. Think about this. Humans evolved in warm climates. Thin skin, minimal body hair, bodies built for heat, not cold. By every biological measure, humans should never have survived an ice age winter at all. And yet they did. Not through biology. Through invention. Number 1. Clothing. This might be the single most underrated survival technology in human history. Without it, none of the rest matters. Let that sink in. Archaeological evidence suggests that true tailored clothing sewn to fit the body, not just draped over it, may have appeared around the same time humans began pushing into colder regions. This wasn't an accident. It was a requirement. Think about this. A simple animal hide thrown over the shoulders blocks some wind but leaves gaps. Gaps where heat escapes. Gaps where frostbite begins. But a hide cut, shaped and sewn tightly to the body, traps warmth far more effectively. The difference between these two approaches could mean the difference between survival and death. But sewing required something remarkable. The needle, not a modern needle, a bone needle, carved, sharpened, with a tiny hole pierced through one end. Let that sink in. The invention of the eyed needle allowed humans to stitch multiple layers of hide together, creating fitted garments, insulated boots, even underlayers. This simple tool may have done more to expand human survival range than almost any weapon ever created. Think about this. Without the needle, vast stretches of the freezing world may have remained permanently unlivable for humans. Number 2. Layering. Ancient humans didn't rely on a single thick coat. They relied on multiple layers, each with a different purpose. An inner layer to trap body heat, an outer layer to block wind and moisture. Sometimes fur turned inward for insulation, sometimes turned outward to shed snow and rain. Let that sink in. This wasn't guesswork. This was engineering, developed through trial, error, and often deadly consequences. A mistake in clothing design wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be fatal. But wait, clothing alone wasn't enough. Humans needed somewhere to escape the wind entirely. Number 3. Shelter. In many regions, caves provided natural protection. Stable temperatures, walls that blocked freezing wind. But not every group had access to caves. Think about this. In open, treeless environments, some ancient humans built shelters out of something almost unimaginable today. Mammoth bones, massive rib bones and tusks arranged into a dome-like frame, covered with hides to block wind and trap heat. Let that sink in. Entire shelters constructed from the remains of the very animals hunted for food. Nothing wasted. Everything repurposed for survival. These structures weren't small. Some could house multiple family groups through the harshest months of the year. But a shelter without heat was still just a slightly less deadly version of the outdoors. Number 4. Fire. If clothing was the first line of defense, fire was the foundation everything else depended on. Think about this. Fire didn't just provide warmth. It cooked food, making it easier to digest and extracting more calories. It provided light during long winter nights. It kept dangerous predators away from vulnerable sleeping groups. Let that sink in. Maintaining fire through an entire winter wasn't a convenience. It was a full-time responsibility. Someone always had to tend it. Someone always had to gather more fuel. Losing a fire in the depths of winter could mean losing everything. But wait, fire required fuel. And in frozen landscapes, wood wasn't always available. Think about this. In many Ice Age environments, trees were scarce or completely absent, so ancient humans adapted. They burned bone. Animal fat and bone marrow, it turns out, can burn surprisingly well, especially when combined with smaller amounts of available wood or dried grass. Let that sink in. Survival sometimes meant using every single part of an animal, not out of tradition, but out of absolute necessity. Number 5. Food storage. Summer and autumn weren't just seasons of activity. They were seasons of preparation. Think about this. Ancient humans needed to store enough food to survive months, where hunting became difficult and edible plants disappeared entirely. Meat could be dried. Fat could be rendered and stored. In cold enough regions, natural freezing itself acted as preservation. Pits dug into permanently frozen ground. functioned almost like early refrigerators. Let that sink in. Long before humans understood the science of food preservation, they had already discovered practical methods that worked. But wait, fat wasn't just stored as food. It was survival currency. Think about this. Body fat provided insulation. It provided a reserve of energy when food became scarce. Diets during colder months often shifted toward fat-rich foods, not for taste, but because fat provided far more usable energy per bite than lean meat alone. Let that sink in. In extreme cold, eating only lean meat, without enough fat, could actually be dangerous, leaving the body without enough energy to stay warm. But wait, we don't have to guess at all of this. Some of the clearest evidence comes from actual burial sites. Think about this. At a site called Sungir in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered burials dating back over 30,000 years. The bodies were covered in thousands of small ivory beads. Let that sink in. Each bead would have taken significant time to carve by hand. Researchers believe these beads were originally sewn directly onto clothing, which means these weren't simple hides thrown over the shoulders. These were elaborately constructed garments, fitted, decorated, and clearly built to survive extreme cold. Think about this. The amount of effort required to create clothing like this tells us winter survival wasn't treated casually. It was one of the most important technologies a group could develop. But clothing and shelter solved only part of the problem. There was another enemy that came with winter: darkness. Let that sink in. In far northern regions, winter didn't just bring cold, it brought dramatically shortened days, sometimes just a few hours of weak sunlight, followed by long, freezing nights that stretched on and on. Think about this. Extended darkness didn't just affect temperature, it affected the human mind. Isolation, reduced activity, long hours confined closely together in small firelit spaces. Some researchers believe this extended darkness may have driven the development of storytelling, music, and early symbolic thinking. Something had to fill those long, dark hours. Something had to keep a group mentally engaged, when the outside world was nothing but freezing blackness. Let that sink in. Winter may not have only shaped human survival skills. It may have shaped human imagination itself. But not every group faced winter the same way. Think about this. Some ancient human groups chose a different strategy entirely: migration. Rather than enduring the harshest months in one location, certain groups followed food sources across the landscape, moving toward regions with milder conditions, or toward areas where prey animals gathered during colder months. Let that sink in. Staying in place wasn't always the safest option. Sometimes survival meant constant, calculated movement, chasing livable conditions across an unforgiving landscape. But migration carried its own risks. Think about this. Traveling in extreme cold meant exposure with even less shelter available. Crossing frozen rivers, navigating unfamiliar territory. Every decision to move was also a gamble. Stay and risk running out of resources. Move and risk the dangers of travel itself. There was no perfectly safe option. Only calculated risk, weighed carefully by people who understood that any wrong decision could be their last. But here's something fascinating that comparative evidence reveals. Humans weren't the only ones facing this challenge. Think about this. Neanderthals had lived in cold European climates for far longer than modern humans had. Their bodies showed physical adaptations to the cold: shorter limbs, stockier builds, features that helped retain body heat more efficiently. Let that sink in. In some ways, Neanderthals may have been biologically better suited to the cold than the modern humans who eventually arrived in the same regions. But biology alone wasn't the deciding factor. Some researchers believe modern humans may have had an advantage in technology and clothing construction, more advanced sewing techniques, more complex layered garments. Think about this. If this theory holds true, it suggests something remarkable. Innovation and preparation may have mattered just as much as physical adaptation when it came to surviving the same brutal winters. Let that sink in. Two different kinds of humans, two different survival strategies, facing the exact same freezing world. Think about this. Not everyone in the group faced the same risk. Young children and elderly members were often the most vulnerable to extreme cold. Let that sink in. Evidence suggests groups took deliberate steps to protect their most vulnerable members, placing them closest to fires, wrapping them in the warmest, most carefully constructed clothing available, prioritizing their share of stored food during the leanest months. Think about this. This wasn't simply sentiment. It was strategy. A group's long-term survival depended on protecting those who carried knowledge and those who represented its future. Let that sink in. Winter revealed, in the clearest possible way, who a group valued and how far they were willing to go to protect them. Number 6. Cooperation. No single person could gather enough fuel, food, and materials alone. Winter survival required a coordinated group effort. Think about this. Roles likely divided based on ability, some maintaining fires, some repairing clothing and shelter, some managing food stores. Children and elders, though more vulnerable to the cold, still played essential roles passing down knowledge, tending fires, and helping with lighter tasks. Let that sink in. Winter wasn't survived by individuals. It was survived by groups that functioned like a single coordinated organism. But wait, keeping a fire burning was only half the challenge. Starting one, especially in freezing damp conditions, was an entirely different problem. Think about this. Wet wood, frozen ground, numb fingers struggling with basic tasks. Fire that seemed simple in summer became a genuine survival crisis in the depths of winter. Let that sink in. Ancient humans developed specialized techniques for this exact problem. Friction-based fire starting, using carefully selected dry tinder kept protected from moisture. Later, striker-light methods using specific types of stone, capable of producing sparks even in difficult conditions. Think about this. Some groups likely carried protected embers from a previous fire, specifically to avoid the risk of failing to start a new one from scratch. A single ember, carefully preserved, could mean the difference between warmth and freezing to death. But wait, tools themselves needed constant attention during winter months. Think about this. Cold, dry air could cause certain materials to crack or become brittle. Wooden tool handles required regular maintenance. Hide clothing needed constant repair as it wore from daily use. Let that sink in. Winter wasn't a season where humans simply waited out the cold. It was a season of continuous active labor. Repairing, maintaining, preparing. Every single day required deliberate effort just to maintain the systems keeping the group alive. Number 7. Health and illness. Winter didn't just bring cold. It brought unique medical challenges. Think about this. Groups huddled closely together for warmth, created ideal conditions for illness to spread quickly. Limited food variety during the hardest months could weaken immune systems over time. Let that sink in. Evidence from ancient winter settlements sometimes shows signs of illness affecting multiple individuals simultaneously. A single sickness moving through a small, closely confined group could be just as dangerous as the cold itself. Ancient humans likely developed basic knowledge of which plants or treatments could help manage common winter ailments, passed down, tested, and refined across generations, long before anything resembling modern medicine existed. But even with every precaution, winter remained deadly. Think about this. Skeletal evidence from ancient winter settlements sometimes shows signs of malnutrition during the hardest months. Frostbite-related injuries, evidence of illness spreading rapidly through groups confined closely together for warmth. Let that sink in. Not everyone survived. Winter wasn't just a season to endure. It was often the deadliest period of the entire year. The one time when a single mistake, a fire left untended, clothing improperly made, food stores miscalculated, could threaten an entire group's survival. But wait, winter also shaped something beyond physical survival. It shaped human behavior itself. Think about this. The need to plan months in advance, to store food before it was needed, to prepare shelter and clothing before the cold arrived, may have been one of the earliest drivers of long-term human thinking. Let that sink in. Winter didn't just test human bodies. It trained the human mind to think beyond the present moment, to prepare for a future that hadn't happened yet. This kind of forward planning wasn't common in the animal kingdom, but for humans facing the freezing months ahead, it became essential. Some researchers believe this seasonal pressure may have contributed to the development of more complex social structures. Groups that cooperated well, planned carefully, and shared resources fairly were simply more likely to survive winter after winter. Groups that often didn't survive at all. Think about this. Winter may have quietly shaped not just how ancient humans dressed or built shelters, but how they thought, organized, and treated each other. Let that sink in. Even today, many cultures maintain traditions around stockpiling food before winter, gathering with family during the coldest months. Traditions that echo a survival pattern practiced for hundreds of thousands of years, long after the original necessity has faded into comfort and convenience. So how did ancient humans survive the freezing winter? Not through one single invention, but through an entire interconnected system. Clothing that trapped warmth, needles that made precise garments possible, shelter that blocked the wind, fire that never stopped needing attention, food stored months in advance, and cooperation that turned individual survival into collective survival. Think about this. Long before humans understood chemistry, biology, or physics, they had already built a functioning survival system, capable of enduring some of the harshest conditions this planet has ever produced. Let that sink in. Winter didn't just test ancient humans. It shaped them. It forced cooperation, innovation, and planning long before language could fully explain why any of it mattered. And in surviving winter after winter, generation after generation, ancient humans didn't just endure the cold. They built the foundation for everything that came after.